This is Where Did the Road Go? Our aim is to explore the fringe, to be true skeptics and question openly, to investigate the paranormal, bring light to the dark corners of history, and give a voice to the shunned of science. We deal in mystery and the important questions that these subjects bring to light. What is reality? Who are we? And why are we here? Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com for a full show archive, links to all our social media, upcoming schedule, and much, much more. Now, join your host Soraya on this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go? And welcome to Where Did the Road Go? What you're going to hear tonight, I was initially going to have as a midweek podcast earlier in the week, but it turned out so good I decided to leave it for the main show. At this point, midweek podcasts tend to be more conversations with the primary interviews on the main show. But this one, despite being a conversation, like I said, I thought came out really well. We were discussing David Bowie and his occult connections, and knowing how much people love David Bowie, I figured we'll give this the main show this week. Now, if you're a Patreon, you already got to hear this earlier in the week. Anytime I do pre-recorded interviews, as soon as I have them ready to go, as a Patreon, you'll get access to them. If they're multi-parts that I do all at once, you'll get access to those, as well as some extra bits and pieces from various interviews that will never get aired on the main show. Patreon-only type of stuff. As well as some other special stuff coming out for Patreons very soon. It's only $3 a month. Go to wheredidtheroadgo.com if you want to support the show. And without any further ado, here's tonight's show. We are here with Michael Hughes, Joshua Cutchin, and Red Pill Junkie. And we're going to be discussing David Bowie and his connections to various sort of esoteric stuff as it lays out in his music. We were going to do this a few weeks ago, but it was hard getting everyone on the same night for some reason. So a little late, but I think no less relevant. How you doing, guys?
Doing great.
Mike was flying around the world.
I was flying around my bar stool as well in Costa Rica. But it's good to be back. I missed the blizzard, so that was a beautiful thing. I came home.
Yeah, your timing was impeccable.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah,
Missed it by a few hours, right?
Well, I was the last airplane flying out of BWI Airport, so. I mean, literally the last airplane, the whole airport was empty. And one plane took off in front of us, and then we were sitting on the tarmac being de-iced, and I was going, please, let us make it. And we were the last out. So.
Stuff. Yeah. Just a matter of performing an acceptable sacrifice to this no demon.
That's it. Yeah, it must have been those 7 children I immolated before I left, so that took care of things. Oh, I probably shouldn't say that on the podcast.
All right. So, David Bowie, of course, passed away a few weeks ago, and at the age of what, 70?
69.
69. Okay. Everyone keeps dying around 69, 70 lately.
Yeah, it's a rough time for celebrities. I mean, the end of last year, in particular, was really rough.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I feel like we tend to, in our zeitgeist, overblow celebrity death waves. But I've had a lot of people personally that I know have fallen upon hardships after the new year, and also some people that I know who have died, and other people I've talked to have expressed similar sort of concerns about this trend. It seems like a lot of people are going through some really rough stuff in the first 2 months of this year.
Yeah,
well,
yeah. Bowie was big though. I mean, I haven't really felt that same sort of collective shockwave. Really, I don't think since John Lennon, as far as big musicians dying. I mean, it really, my Facebook feed was nothing but Bowie for days and days and days. I mean, it was, and it's surprising. I mean, he was a most people know his big hits and everything, and I always thought I was just one of those freaks that, that really, you know, really dug the guy like I did. But then, you really saw that a lot of people really connected with him, for a lot of different reasons. I mean, it was something about the guy was just bigger than life, in so many ways.
And like Lemmy, he was going right till the end, which I think is how everyone should do it. Really.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, the Black Star album, which was kind of his last album. Really, I mean, he knew that it was going to be his last album. So, and you can tell that it's very much a final statement from the man. It's deep, it's enigmatic, it's creepy, it's beautiful. He really put his all into it. It's like a final, really feels like a final testament from Bowie. Like, I'm going out and I'm going to do it my way, and I'm going to leave you scratching your heads and digging into this stuff. And that's, I mean, it's all I've been doing. I've had the song Black Star as the worst earworm I've ever had. I mean, it won't go away. It finally went away when I was in Costa Rica, but for weeks, I would just hear verses from that, popping up in my head. It's better than, God, like, some god awful one of my kids' songs when that happens to get in my head sometimes. That's for sure.
Yeah.
But it was, so I'd love to hear. I mean, would you guys think along those lines too? If you've listened to the album much, or like, how it affected you? Because I have to be told to shut up. Because I could just keep on. So please.
Well, the striking thing about Bowie, and I've heard some people say that perhaps the death of Michael Jackson was one of these cultural touchstones that possibly echoed this, but it seems to go a lot deeper than that for me. And as someone who is very familiar with his work, but at the same time wouldn't really consider myself a Bowie fan, like I appreciate his work, and I'm not a Bowie fan. I own every one of his albums, but I don't consider myself a Bowie fan. Which I think speaks something to his particular discography. But it's really interesting because he's one of those people who was able to walk a bunch of different artistic lifestyles. I mean, you look at speaking to the latest album, Black Star, the music video for the title track Lazarus, and it is heart-wrenching to watch that. With the knowledge that he it's not on a conscious level, at least on an unconscious level, knew how deep he was into his illness. And to watch that particular music video unfold with all of its imagery, which seems to resonate in a lot of ways that, you look at a lot of music videos and they just seem to be obsessed with putting out cool imagery, but you feel like, I feel like Bowie until the very end was always layering stuff in that had multiple meanings and that would resonate in a conscious manner and an unconscious manner as well.
Okay, Red Pill.
Okay, so I cannot claim to be like the biggest David Bowie fan out there. I know that I like many of his hit videos, especially Space Oddity. It really gets me on a very deep personal level. But the thing that attracts me about Bowie is how he was so interested in many of the things that interest me, like the paranormal, the occult, and apparently also the UFO phenomenon, which was the reason why he ended up starring in movies like The Man Who Fell to Earth, which I feel is a must-see to anyone interested in this topic. And also the fact that David Bowie claimed to have witnessed having watched UFOs on several occasions when he was very early in his childhood. And also I think that when he was already an established and a very famous artist. There is this quote that was printed in this book, The Laughing Gnostic, David Bowie and the Occult, which
Mm-hmm.
was authored by Peter Koenig. And there was this is like the explanation that Bowie gave to this sighting he had, while he was traveling across the English countryside with a friend. So it's a paraphrasing of the actual quote, but this is the gist of it. David Bowie said, "I believe that what I saw was not the actual object, but a projection of my own mind trying to make sense of this quantum topological doorway into dimensions beyond our own. It's as if our dimension is but one among an infinite number of others." So even though Bowie wasn't really an UFO investigator per se, I think this quote in itself is far deeper, far more interesting, and far more on point than what many UFO investigators have said about the phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
Zero arguments for me on that point. I would definitely agree with that. Yeah, but I think part of that, I think of a lot of the people who were involved with the subject that I really admire. Have artistic backgrounds. Bud Hopkins started out as an artist. Mike Clellan, another person who was, an artist himself.
Yeah.
I think that artists, and this isn't to diminish um, folks who are involved in more restrictive disciplines, but I think artists have the
You mean
ability to
losers?
articulate. Yeah. well, I didn't say it.
No, sorry.
No, we all want to be accountants, really. We all do. Okay. but I think that there's an ability to articulate some of the nuances in the phenomena there that a lot of people don't quite glom onto. And I don't know if that's the phenomena seeking out people who can articulate like that, or if it's the people who articulate it best seeing the phenomena. But either way, I totally agree with you, Red Pill. Spot
By
on.
the, by, by the way, Josh, I always love your use of the word glom.
Do I do that often?
All right. So I, myself, I'm not that familiar with Bowie. I have a lot of respect for the guy, but I never really got into him. But he's always been an innovator, as far as I could tell, with all the different stuff he did. But want to talk? Who wants to get into a little bit of some of his esoteric connections?
Yeah, I can run with that ball for a few minutes. Yeah, I mean, Bowie was he was a magician, I mean, a out and out magician, in sort of every way that word can be used. I mean, he was a magician of changing himself, of metamorphosing, through these
Mhm.
different characters from the Davy Jones, pop singing about fairies and things like that. And then he became Bowie, then Ziggy Stardust and the Thin White Duke. And, I mean, he was always just changing and metamorphosing. And, with his sexuality, I mean, he came out as bisexual, when it was, very not cool to do such things. And I remember as a kid when I was first becoming aware of him, it was because, one of my cousins would say, "Oh, he's gay, man," and things like that. But he really walked the border between all sorts of worlds. But even as between the male and female world, he crossed the line like so many shamans do. And
Exactly.
especially if you look at a lot of shamanic societies from the American Indian to other cultures as well. The shaman is often like of indeterminate sexuality, sort of an
Hmm.
in between. And again, that goes to that liminal state where things are one way and the other, and all that. But when it comes to magic, I mean, he actually practiced magic for a while. And you hear that in his lyrics on the Station to Station album when he's talking about the Kabbalah, and going from Kether to Malkuth, on the various sephirots of the Tree of Life. And then he talks about the Golden Dawn. And he really did. He went through a stage where he was actually a practicing magician of the Kabbalistic sort. And so his work has always had this mystic layer. He was always a seeker. He was always clearly, trying different methods to, access his higher self or holy guardian angel, things like that. He was into Crowley's, Thelema. I mean, the guy was he was deep, I mean, he was really, he was a practitioner. He wasn't just a
Mhm.
dilettante. And then you look at some of the stories about him, though, especially the period where, he was also heavily into cocaine, which coincided with the period of his deepest occult work that he was doing, and he really got pretty far out there. I mean, he thought Jimmy Page was doing black magic against him. He thought witches were trying to steal his semen. He kept his urine
But who
in
doesn't think that, right?
containers. Yeah, yeah, of
Right.
course.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I mean they're out there, and you have to be careful. But I mean, he was keeping his fingernail clippings and his hair and stuff like that,
Yeah.
sequestered away because you know, uh, cocaine, when you're abusing cocaine the way he was abusing it, I mean, it tends to make people very paranoid. So, he was drawing
Yeah.
sigils on it, on pentagrams all over the place he lived with his wife Angie. He was doing, banishings all the time, and I mean, he really got, in his own estimate, he was just, clinically paranoid. And at one point in an interview, I think it was with, Cameron Crowe, I think, somebody, he said I was hallucinating 24 hours a day. So, when you combine heavy drug intake with deep, really deep occult work like that, it's usually a prescription for for disaster. And in his case, it led to his flirtations with fascism and Nazism and stuff like that. Again, that he, later interviews, he claims a lot of that was taken out of context, and but he really went down the dark road, um, yeah, but fueled by the immense amounts of cocaine, but also his paranoia from being, from living in that magical sort of, esoteric realm. You threw that all in the mix, and man, he was in rough shape for a while.
But it's
Wow.
it's interesting to me that he gravitated. I mean, obviously artists gravitate towards substances. As an artist myself, I'm aware of a lot of people who have had these issues. Um, but also artists gravitate towards the occult, and it's interesting that he was such a poster child for both of those things. And it's not like he even like tried to, you think about people being interested in these subjects in the modern day. I mean, there's I think that most modern artists would try to obscure it in some way, or they would try to downplay it because of the fear of some sort of backlash. Um, but Bowie really wore it on his sleeve in a lot of ways. I mean, you look at the opening two lines to his song "Quicksand," or I'm closer to the golden dawn, immersed in Crowley's uniform. It's
Hmm.
it's
Hmm.
it's right out front, and
Hmm.
it really seems to me that he was speaking to satisfying his own interests versus some sort of interests. Or rather trying to satisfy the public, and that's what he did until the very end. Is that he did stuff for himself, which
Yeah.
is truly admirable.
Hmm.
The thing is too nowadays, like it's really popular for pop stars to mention the Golden Dawn and the OTO and stuff like this. But I suspect they don't have a clue as to what they're really talking about, or any kind of deep interest. I know years ago you had Madonna talking about the Kabbalah, and it seemed like that was sort of just a pop version of it without any real deep meaning behind it. I mean, maybe I'm wrong there, but it seems like it at times can be a very pop culture thing. And then, of course, you get all the Illuminati conspiracies
Oh
around
yeah.
it. Um, but I don't think there's a lot of musicians who actually get that deep into it. I don't think there's a lot of people that really go that deep into it. I mean, even in metal, I mean, you have a lot of bands who talk about this stuff, but so many of them you can tell are just kind of like they like the imagery, they like the idea, but they're not really deep into it unless you're dealing with Carl McCoy of Fields of the Nephilim or someone like that, or like the guys from Therion or something.
Mhm.
You don't have that real depth behind it, and with
Yeah.
Bowie, you seem to have some depth behind it.
Yeah, and and you're so right. I mean, nowadays with all these, there's a site called Vigilant Citizen or something that's one of the worst offenders in this realm. But it seeks all the the Illuminati programming and all the videos and halftime shows and all this stuff. And it's like,
Every Super Bowl, yeah,
right?
every
Yeah,
Super
it's
Bowl
like
halftime show
it's
is
like
Illuminati
you're
recruiting
being
it.
played. I mean, these guys, these Illuminati chasers, they think they're on to something, and they're just completely being played. It's like a feedback loop. The more these armchair sleuths decide that Beyonce's latest video is an Illuminati charade to control, mind controlled assassins or something. The more of this crap that comes out there, the more these artists use it and play it up. But you're totally right. I mean, and honestly, because being an occultist, having dabbled, probably I should say more than dabbled in several different systems over years and years, it's hard work, man. It's not putting on a robe and some cool goth makeup and lighting a candle. I mean, it's work, it's memorization, it's learning you know Latin and Hebrew and all this other stuff. And yeah, so I mean, I think it's probably very unlikely that a lot of these musicians and artists that affect an occultist persona actually have done the hard work, that it takes to be serious about this stuff. Bowie clearly did. I mean, he was not a dilettante, and that definitely, put him in a different league than most of his peers for sure.
Mhm.
And could I throw one more anecdote that I love the story?
Sure.
He moved. I think it was in his paranoid, coked up phase. He moved from one house in L.A. to another, and he found out after he moved that the house he had moved into used to belong to Gypsy Rose Lee, and in that house she had painted a pentagram on the floor in one of the rooms. So he was convinced this house, there was some crazy stuff going on in this house. And then he became convinced that there was a demon and it lived in the swimming pool.
Ah, the swimming pool. Yeah, the staying
So
in the swimming pool.
so he convinced Angie, his wife, that they were going to exorcise the demon of the swimming pool. So they went out and he had his candles and whatever other stuff, incense and wand or dagger or whatever. I don't know what he used, but he performed an exorcism at the swimming pool. And Angie, who was just kind of going along with it and thought he was cracked and didn't really believe that there was a demon in the swimming, she said the water began to bubble and a
Mm.
dark stain appeared at the bottom of the swimming pool. So hey man, he may have actually been on to the demon living in his swimming pool, it sounds like. Or he created it, right? Exactly.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's something that I mentioned beforehand before we started talking. It feels like just that he was. I mean, yes, granted, he had an interest in these sort of things, but it feels like he, as a person, as we often see with a lot of different phenomena, was sort of a focal point for a lot of these phenomena to gather around.
Mhm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yes, he was interested in it, but I'm not entirely sure that he chicken the egg. I'm not entirely sure that he was interested in it and it happened to him, or if it happened to him and he was interested in it. But he definitely was. In terms of, you look at figures with his sort of international visibility, there aren't a lot of people who are as touched by the paranormal, for lack of a better term,
Mhm.
as he was. And it's really
Mhm.
it's part of the reason that I, when I found out that he had passed, it really hit me like a punch in the gut.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm. To me, one of the interesting intersections between David Bowie and all the Fortean phenomena is the fact that he starred in the movie The Hunger,
Yeah.
alongside Susan Sarandon and what was the name of the other actress? Catherine Deneuve. So The Hunger is based on the horror novel written by a guy named Whitley Strieber,
Right.
right? And this
Mhm.
was years before Strieber wrote Communion and came out of the abduction closet, as it were, right? And
Mhm.
many people in the field believe that both The Hunger and also Strieber's other horror novel, The Wolfen,
Wolfen.
are in
Mhm.
fact some kind of artistic interpretation or some kind of which were heavily influenced by the experiences that were happening to Whitley Strieber, but which he hadn't actually acknowledged consciously. So
Mhm.
his artistic unconscious was feeding on it, and that's why he was portraying these vampire-like entities in the Hunger, which are very close to what people in the UFO field call the Nordics.
Mhm.
David Bowie, is like the kind of like the perfect rendition of a
Mhm.
Nordic alien, and so that's to me that's fascinating how he even before Strieber was involved with the UFO phenomenon, David Bowie was already embedding himself into all of this.
Yeah, and I mean also, creating an alien persona for himself with Ziggy
Hmm.
Stardust and and then in The Man Who Fell to Earth,
Hmm. Hmm.
Nicholas Roeg's film where he is, an alien from another world and he always spoke about his feeling of sort of alienation as well. And there's been all this chatter since his death about him being a so-called walk-in, that
Uh,
that idea is seemingly gained traction with a lot of people. And what interested me about that, I mean, I don't necessarily, I'm not so sure about that. I have no real opinion on it. But in the lyrics to Black Star, he says, it's about his spirit rises a meter and then steps inside, and then something else steps in. And this other
mm,
thing that steps in bravely cries, I'm a black star. So, he kind of maybe he was playing with that idea of another being. And what blew me away, kind of coincidentally, is Dave Stewart from the Eurythmics, the other half of the Eurythmics of
oh yeah, yeah.
Annie Lennox.
Mhm.
He just gave an interview, and of course the headline for the interview, and he was linked with Bowie, by the way. He had a little spent some time with Bowie, like everyone seems to have,
Mhm.
in the entertainment world. But he just the headline for the article I just read about him was that he had sex with Stevie Nicks. I'm like, oh, okay, whatever. But luckily I don't care. But I read past that, and he claims that in 1970 he was in a car accident, and he went out of his body, and something else came in. And he
Hmm.
says to the person interviewing him, he says, "Yeah, I'm not the person I was. Another being came into me, and that's who I've been since 1970." So, and that had this little weird oblique connection with Bowie, that really, when I read that, it really kind of set my mind, spinning. Um, but yeah, but Bowie, he's always had that alien presence, more so, and of course he played that up and he invented that, but more so than really any other entertainer, I think. If you ask people, if you had to pick a rock star that is an actual alien, who would that be?
Yeah,
Maybe Michael
yeah.
Jackson after, all his surgery or something,
Right.
but Bowie's, I mean, he lived that persona for so long,
Yeah.
like a chameleon, some kind of alien chameleon, just shape shifting his way through life.
I mean, I would argue that like Robert Johnson touched on that some too. with
Mm-hmm.
his, you know,
Sure.
his sort of the lore surrounding him. But yeah, in terms of like, in
Yeah.
terms of what we consider to be in terms of somebody playing that alien idea to the hilt,
Mm-hmm.
it's Bowie all the way,
Yeah.
all the way.
Yeah.
Mhm,
The Star
mhm.
Man, I mean,
Hmm. Now you were saying something about the way he writes lyrics too.
oh yeah, yeah. Joshua brought that up, and a little earlier before we got on the air, and yeah, Bowie, he used a technique he got from William S. Burroughs, and also Brian Geisen, who was an occultist as well, and that's of cutting up. Like Burroughs would take a newspaper and he'd cut up little sentences or words, and he'd mix them all up and he'd randomly place them in order. And what Burroughs started to find out, and the way he described it, he says when you cut up reality, the future leaks through. And he would
Mm.
find that as he did these cut ups, from newspapers, they would actually predict things that he would find out would later happen. So Burroughs used it as like a divination tool, and I think that's where Bowie got it from. But a lot of his lyrics worked the same way. He'd write some things and then he'd cut it up, or he'd take a document and or different documents, cut them up, and then randomly put them in order and write songs based on that, which is a pretty cool way of it's kind of putting your subconscious to work, but also letting randomness kind of create your art, which I always thought was fascinating.
Well, and randomness, but also randomness like joined with constriction. You know, you look at a lot of the great artists, and every artist that you will ever talk to says that constriction breeds creativity. I mean, it's the entire reason that Schoenberg
Hmm.
came
Mm.
up with Schoenberg embraced atonalism and then decided to go to serialism because it gave him some sort of structure to work with them. Um,
Hmm.
but also beyond that, it really speaks to. Um, it really speaks to this sort of like I Ching-esque way of approaching creativity as well, which is the
Mhm,
first thing that I saw. Because when you look at his system before, apparently he had a software algorithm developed for him. But when you looked at him like using the paper system, it looks so much like somebody like reading the I Ching. It's not even funny.
Hmm.
If anybody wants to search for it, there's a um, BBC interview that resurfaced after his death, where it shows him like going through and shuffling all these different scraps of paper, and it's this wonderful thing because it really is this idea of this modular look at creativity that I don't think really comes out a lot these days.
Hmm.
Hmm. All right.
Yeah,
So
that's a really good way to the modular description. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, I've actually used that a little bit myself, and it's great. It's a technique anyone can, as soon as this podcast is over, just go and grab a magazine, a newspaper, anything. And there are even online, if you look up the cut up machine or something like that, I think it is, you can plug in, you copy a piece of text from somewhere, put it in, and it will cut it up for you. I've always
Yeah,
found though, like with a lot of things, like with tarot cards, which is something I've been into since I was 11 years old. There are, you can do your cards in a web browser, but for me, that's never quite the same. And it's
right.
never quite as on point as when you do something manually. So if you want to try the cut ups, I encourage anybody listening. It's fascinating. And it's a good way to teach your mind, like Joshua, like you were saying, it's a way to, sort of modularize your creativity. And I've had some really dramatic stuff come out from cutting things up and randomly putting it back together, rearranging it. So it's a great occult technique. Or even if you can get the occult out of it, just use it as a great creative technique to get your creative juices going. So, do it. I think you will be really, really impressed with
yeah.
some of the stuff that comes out.
Those are excellent points, and also, what it speaks to me is too is even the funny thing that a lot of people don't realize is when they like sort of push an option like that off the table, so they don't realize is that in being forced to like look at these different combinations, even if you don't like it, you'd be like, oh well, I would like that if it said this. That's still part of
Hmm.
the creative process, you know.
Exactly.
It yeah,
You know, Greg Bishop, who, as you guys well know, is about to publish his anthology compilation of UFO essays. He had a lot of problem coming up with a title for it, and he ended up using this cutout system, and the system managed him to find this title. It defies language, which he finally chose for it.
I hadn't even put that together, but you're right, Greg. That's the exact. Sorry, Greg. Jeez, you're right, Miguel. That's the exact same system that Greg used. That's interesting.
Yep.
Now, Red Pill, you were saying that you were always interested in his Labyrinth work.
Well, that was Joshua, but yeah, I'm also really fascinated by that movie because I think nowadays you will be hard pressed to find a modern rendition of fairy tales, which would be as dark and as obscure as Labyrinth was. I mean, it really shows just how really dark and creepy the original fairy tales was. Because here in this movie, it's all about uh, these trollish entities kidnapping a kid, and also this the Goblin King being infatuated with a prepubescent girl. So all these really adult stuff, put forward in what apparently is a movie for children, but if you really dig deeper, you find that it is not.
Yeah, this is where I cracked my knuckles, and this is where I I decided to dive in. I have one of the more popular posts on my blog is this idea of I embarked on this effort to find the most um, fairy faithful, folklore faithful cinema representation. Because there's a film that's coming out and it's already come out in the UK that I haven't seen yet called The Hallows, which looked really promising. But it
Hmm.
sort of sparked me on this quest to find um, the most faithful film to sort of fairy folklore. And I have a soft spot for Muppets and hints and lore in my family, but I honestly did not expect that Labyrinth would come up as the most fairy faithful film. But and not to say that this is all sort of tangential. Not to say that Bowie had any real input. I think that there were some other people who were up for the role. I think not coincidentally, I think Mick Jagger was up for the role, and some
Hmm.
other pop stars. Michael
Mm.
Jackson was up for the role too, which sort of you can see what that would have been in Captain EO
Yeah.
role is sort of what you would have probably gotten out of a Michael Jackson Goblin King. But I was super surprised to find out how faithful Labyrinth was to fairy folklore. I mean, first of all, you've got all this vast array of Muppets masquerading as different types of goblins and fairies and things, and they're all of different shapes and sizes. Even Ludo looks like the Celtic woodwose. um, but
Hmm.
the child is stolen in the beginning of the film. Um, Jareth the Goblin King, played by David Bowie, is a taller entity supervising smaller entities, which is something that you see not only in fairy folklore but also in alien folklore.
Hmm.
Um, there's this weird loosey goosey time component to the film where he gives her like I think it's like 13 hours or 12 hours to complete her task, and it takes place in the course of one evening, which is again this time compression component that you see in fairy and alien folklore. But one of the things that obviously piqued my interest was Jareth gives Hoggle, who is one of her companions, this troll-like being, a peach to have her eat, and she eats the peach and she passes out, and basically it gives her this altered state of consciousness by eating the peach, which definitely ties up with my own research. But you know, beyond that, looking to what Bowie did and Bowie's role in this, it's interesting because his theme song for the actual film called Underground, I just noticed this a couple of weeks ago, features the lyrics, well, obviously down in the underground, which is, I think, sort of evocative of fairy lore. You know, fairies always used to live in fairy mounds under the earth.
Mm-hmm.
But there's
Mhm.
one lyric where one of the lyrics is "It's only forever," which again, I feel like speaks to this sort of time component, this temporal component as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but and the guy who was one of the primary forces behind Labyrinth was Brian Froud, um, uh, who was one of the great artists of fairy imagery. There's an excellent 2000 documentary called The Fairy Faith, which is on YouTube. Anybody who hasn't seen it, who has any even a passing interest in this, should look it up now because it's fascinating. I generally
Mm.
Oh
watch it
yeah.
once a year. It's one of the it's one of the few things in this genre that I watch once a year because it's so compelling.
Mm. Mm.
Um, but Froud's featured in that as well, and he definitely expresses a very concrete interest in fairy phenomenon in terms of the way that he believes it interacts with our our current worldview. But again, coming back to Bowie, Bowie's character is often represented in a lot of the Labyrinth scenes by an owl, which
Hmm.
Mm.
and
Mm-hmm.
again, anyone who's familiar with the work of Whitley Strieber and Screen Memories, and also more prominently our good friend Mike Cleland, will recognize how that's quite significant. And I found it really funny. There was a 1982 film of a children's book called The Snowman. Are any of you familiar with this?
I am not. No.
No.
It's a very charming wordless documentary set to this just wonderful score. Um, it's almost on this like a colored pencil style. But the beginning of the Snowman on the television version, the televised version, my DVD doesn't have this, but the televised version of the Snowman was introduced by none other than David Bowie. And David
Hmm.
Bowie comes
Hmm.
on and talks about this interesting experience he had just in terms of like his childhood in England. And as soon as he finishes, within 10 seconds, the first image on the screen is an owl flying directly at the screen.
Oh,
Um, so again, it's one of those things like, do I think that there's
brilliant.
any sort of greater meaning to this? Do I think that David Bowie orchestrated an owl appearing in the Snowman, do I think that David Bowie had any real creative hand in Labyrinth? I don't. But he's one of these people that these sort of, if we engage in the synchronicitous philosophy, a lot of these phenomena, these things gravitate toward him in such a profound way that you just need to scratch a little bit and you can just see complex webs of interaction with what we would consider Fortiana.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Okay. They're actually redoing Labyrinth too, aren't they?
Oh no, I hope not.
I actually heard
Yeah.
that it was going to be a sequel and not a reboot. There was
Really?
sort of a yeah, and again, like they also announced about, geez, probably about 10 years ago, a sequel to the Dark Crystal, which has never materialized. So I would take
Yeah.
that with a grain of salt. But from
Yeah.
what I hear, the Henson family is intent on making it a sequel and not a reboot.
Okay.
I also even heard that they were planning to do a remake of The Man Who Fell to Earth, but I don't know what happened
Hmm.
to that project.
Huh. Interesting.
So what about Bowie's Crowley connections?
Yeah. Well, he like anyone who decides to sort of pursue any sort of interest in the occult, you can't help but wind up with old Uncle Al in the picture somewhere. And he was, I don't think he was a Thelemite per se, but I know he was deeply engaged in Crowley's style of magic. Um, and obviously Jimmy Page was the most well-known aficionado of Crowley,
Right.
living in his mansion and all that sort of thing. And again, there was that Bowie at one point was fearful that Page was doing dark magic on him, and Bowie tried to protect himself and throw the dark magic back at Page and all that stuff. So he definitely expressed an interest in Crowley. I think later, uh, he sort of, especially when he got when Bowie became sort of hit this weird little fascist phase of his, where he, you know, and a lot of what he said was kind of taken out of context, but he was clearly, he was he was um, deeply impressed at the the way the Nazis used imagery, their uniforms, you know, the power that they projected, and he talked about Hitler as being the first real rock star.
Hmm.
You know,
Mm.
which when you think about it, really kind of does make sense. You know, I mean, Hitler was more than just you know, any old politician. You know, he had this almost, you know, occult, you know, of course there's, you know, been plenty of theorizing about the Nazi interest in the occult and the Tula society, and their interest in recovering the Holy Grail. You know, there's a whole enormous mythology, you know,
Right.
some of it more, you know, based in reality than others, but
Mhm.
you know, Bowie was also he was very much into Trevor Ravenscroft's book on the Spear of Destiny, which was about allegedly about the Nazis trying to recover the spear that pierced the side of Christ when he was on the
Hmm.
cross. He was very caught up in that for a long time, and uh, so what I see is what kind of was happening at this period in his career, in his life, as he started falling prey to the um, you know, it's a real problem in occultism, is when people get these kind of overinflated egos, you know, and they start thinking that they're, you know, almighty and powerful. And that's really always one of the consequences of occultism, where you see all the way back from the Golden Dawn, when the Golden Dawn just self-destructed and blew up, you know, it was always based on, you know, overinflated egos and people
Right.
too in
Mm.
love with their own power. And I think that's what was happening to Bowie at that point. I mean, he was fascinated by the Nazis. He talked about himself as if he could be, you know, some sort of fascist leader. He said, I would have been a great, you know, fascist leader. And you know, he did have an immense magnetism about himself. And you know, when you think of if he had, you know, really dedicated himself to politics or the dark side or something like that, I mean, he really might have gotten somewhere with that. You know, but luckily, I think as he sort of, you know, that the left-hand path was taking him down a road that was leading him to self-destruction, you know, he sort of turned that around and abandoned, you know, he kind of shook himself out of that, whatever that phase that he was in, where fascism was such a fascinating, attractive thing. And it really is like a, you know, it's a dark spot in his career. I think there was even a group formed called like Rockers Against Fascism or something.
Hmm.
When he was quoted in a couple of these publications, you know, talking about his fascination with the Nazis and totalitarianism and things like that. So I mean, you know, in retrospect, years later, he really kind of pushed back and said, you know, that was crazy stuff I was doing at the time. So yeah, I think that his fascination with Crowley, you know, Crowley, who also was not the greatest human being, you know, and he was a
Right.
fantastic musician, but you know, left a couple of wives, you know, in the asylum, or you know, or just completely financially wiped out and things like that. I mean, um, you know, I think Bowie probably was going down a similar track, and luckily, you know, luckily for all of us, but more luckily for him, really, he climbed out of that pit that he was in. It probably had a lot to do with his stopping, you know, the massive amounts of cocaine that he was doing.
Right.
You know, he
Hmm.
also stopped drinking at one point also. So you know, he managed to pull himself out of that pit that so many musicians and artists, you know, kind of happen to fall into.
Okay. Is there anywhere else we should go with this? I mean, you guys are more familiar with Bowie than I am.
Mhm.
I'd like to say something about anyone who's listening that hasn't watched the two videos that he's released from the Black Star album, that Joshua mentioned earlier. I think Red Pill talked about a little bit earlier too. You really have to watch those videos. I mean, when I watched Black Star for the first time, I had chills. I mean, it's such a powerful example of his art, and how Joshua said earlier that he layered so much stuff. I mean, it is a smorgasbord of imagery, and I've heard that video um, dissected now from so many different angles, as being about Isis, the goddess, as being
Ooh.
about ISIS, the crazy fundamentalist, murderous folks, terrorizing their people and beheading people and things like that. I've heard it as a Horus, Osiris. It's amazing, and it just goes to show how much that the man put into his art. I mean, it has rituals going on in it. It has, imagery from his career as Major Tom. He's wearing an outfit in, I think, the Lazarus video. It's like a skin tight sort of suit that has white stripes on it, almost
Right.
almost looking like lines of cocaine if you look at it that way. The same costume that he was wearing on the cover of the Station to Station album, where he's drawing the Kabbalistic tree of life on the floor. It's so beautiful and so dense, and it's amazing to watch people delve into it and pull things out of all that imagery. So if you haven't seen it, I'd be surprised if anyone listening to this episode in particular hasn't seen it yet. Just put that on, turn out the lights, put your headphones on, and just be immersed in a piece of art that I feel is just stunning. And like his career, there's so many levels to it, and there's so many ways of looking at it, and it's got so much occult imagery, so much metaphorical stuff going on. It's just absolutely brilliant. And to think that he left us with that as like his parting gift to the world, I just think is phenomenal. You know just go look up online how people are digging into these videos, and how much they're seeing, and how much, either they're projecting, or he put in there, or a mixture of both. But I haven't experienced anything like it
Well,
in a very long time.
yeah, and something else that I would add to that is that it's it's not particularly comfortable to watch.
Oh no.
Neither of those are, and I think that's something that is profoundly missing from a lot of our art these days. You know,
That's
both
such a
bur-
good such a good point. That's such a good point.
Yeah.
I mean, the first time you drink bourbon, it's not very pleasant either. But if you can acclimatize yourself to some of the more uncomfortable aspects, um, it becomes more pleasant. And a lot of Bowie's work, and it's probably the reason that I'm not as big a Bowie fan as I would like to be, is because a lot of what he has done has been quite challenging. Um, but as far as other directions to take this, it's not like his acting roles were restricted to the films that we've talked about. I mean, he was also in a role in Twin Peaks, which has a lot of
Yeah.
occult connections as well.
Hmm.
Sporting an awful southern accent, I might add, on Twin Peaks. But also, again, he tended to gravitate towards these very esoteric roles. One of the best things that I think he did in his latter years in terms of acting was his depiction of Nikola Tesla in The Prestige. Whether or not you like the film or
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
he was transcendent in that role in terms of just what he was able to do with a limited amount of screen time.
Hmm. Yeah, he's everywhere. I mean, it's amazing how many people, and I mean, he was around for a long time, certainly, but for the kind of things we talk about on this show, almost, you know, he's hiding behind every little crack. It's
Hmm.
just stunning when you look at, I guess, the stereotypical idea, like the degrees of separation and in the fields, the stuff that we talk about, I mean, he's everywhere, I mean, he's from the Strieber thing to, I mean, he was born in 1947, the year of the, so-called Roswell crash, the year Crowley died. Um, I mean, it really is. It's shocking how interwoven he is with Fortiana, with the esoteric, and that's really astounding to me. That's such a that an artist, touched so many different areas with his art.
True, true. You know, the way his last videos were there, and like you're saying about his last album, makes me think of Johnny Cash covering "Hurt" at the very end of his career, and that video for that.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
the same way, where he knew that was near the end when he was doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And he took a Nine Inch Nails song that was I thought was great to begin with and made it 1,000 times better.
Yeah,
Like so
yeah.
much, it meant so much more when he did it, and you could see the imagery with him in it. Yeah, that's what I was thinking of when I watched the Lazarus video.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, and to be able to give a parting, to know that you're dying, yeah, and to still have the, the desire. I mean, a lot of people would just forget about their art and, focus on their family or, whatever. But I mean, for him to remain so committed to his art that, and to give us something that is so powerful and so profound, and so much more so now that we know that it was his parting gift to the
Yeah,
world. I mean, that is just it gives me chills. I mean, I still, every time I listen, there's a song at the end of that album, where he's talking about, I can't give everything. He's almost saying, I've given it all. And when you listen to that song in particular, a friend of mine, Gareth Branwyn, who's a writer, um, t- alerted me to this. He said, put your headphones on and listen to that song, and you can hear Bowie's breathing. It's almost kind of labored breathing, but most musicians, they don't want you to hear the breath,
sure.
but in their vocals, but you hear his breathing, and it made me wonder, like, man, is he saying these are my last breaths too?
Breaths. Hmm.
It was just so powerful. Um, yeah, it's a really dynamic album, and I haven't gotten sick of listening to it yet. It's been on, almost constant run whenever I listen to music. So just the fact that for an artist to know this is it, I mean, this is my final chance to say something. What's it going to be? And like Joshua said, the fact that it's not all, sweetness and light. I mean, he went out giving us something that is dark and disturbing, but yet, beautiful at the same time. I mean, it's got a really immense beauty, and it's a mixed bag of darkness and light. And it's just what a powerful last thing to just put down, put out there for all of us to listen to.
All right. Anything else, guys?
A handful of thoughts. Another film role that can't believe I didn't mention earlier, which has been really not influential, I guess, but impactful, as much as I hate that word, upon me, was his role as Pontius Pilate in The Last Temptation of Christ,
Oh
which
yeah,
is
yeah.
a fantastic film. I think that anyone, atheist or Christian, should watch that film because it's incredibly powerful. But I would also be remiss if I would not acknowledge his progeny, which is Duncan Jones, who is
Yeah.
one of the leading forces in modern hard sci-fi these days. His film Moon is transcendental, I feel.
Oh
It's
yeah.
an excellent work of art. I feel that Source Code, the follow-up film, is less than so, and I have reservations about the World of Warcraft movie, but
Is he
hopefully this
directing that?
he is, which is the
Oh
only
wow, I
thing,
didn't know that. Huh.
it's the only thing that gives me hope for it. That and the guy that in fact that the guy who portrays Ragnar Lothbrok in Vikings is the starring protagonist, which I like the Vikings show as well. But yeah, I have great faith in what Duncan Jones does in general. Because even though Source Code I think was a lesser effort than Moon, it was still a great work of sci-fi. So
I thought it was.
what was that? I'm sorry.
I thought it was enjoyable.
Oh yeah, absolutely. My problem with source code is I wish that it had just like ended on one of the fatalistic kissing shots where they're just doomed to repeat the same thing over and over again.
Mm.
That probably speaks more to my to my sensibilities than it does anything else. But Moon is just one of those films that I think just comes along once in a generation, and I really and it's interesting to think that this guy grew up in the household of David Bowie. You know.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And guess what? Was announced today. Duncan Jones and his wife are having a baby. And my first thought, of course, was, what if this baby has eyes of two different colors?
Oh.
If only, right? My only tangential connection to Duncan Jones is that a good friend of mine's cousin was Duncan Jones's roommate for a while, but that's about it.
Hmm.
Which I guess is closer than a lot of people, but still too far away to mean anything.
Well, that's a few degrees from Bowie, so that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Closer than
So
any of mine. Although I have a friend that spent a whole day with Bowie once, so I
that's
guess
amazing. Are you
I'm
serious?
two. Yeah, yeah. He won some contest and he went to New York and hung around the studio with David Bowie for like hours and hours one day. Yeah.
That sounds like it'll be amazing because I recently read an article that said that he used to carry around a Greek newspaper just so that people wouldn't ask him because he'd be like, "Oh, that guy's reading a Greek newspaper. It must not be David Bowie." So here's something that might be if we're starting to wrap up this whole endeavor. This might be a good direction to take it. Favorite Bowie songs? Anybody?
Oh man. Um, phew,
Space Oddity for me.
yeah, I'd say I've always been a big fan of Ashes to Ashes. Uh, I have to say though, man, Black Star is so deeply embedded in my brain now. It's hard to shake. So, but before that, uh, man, I mean, I think I wore out the vinyl of my Changes 1 Bowie and Changes 2 Bowie, so it's really hard to pick one. But there was always something about Ashes to Ashes that really, really got me there.
Yeah, I totally get that.
And I'm going to pass on it because I've never really listened that much to
Well, you've got to catch up, Soraya.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, it's always been Life on Mars. When you look at
Actually, I do like that song.
Yeah.
I liked it because it was in the TV series there.
yeah, which the I haven't seen the American version, but the British version is fantastic. I love that. I love that show so much. But to me, that particular song conveys so much emotion, and if you look at the vocal range of that song and what it like showcases, and also in terms of the stylistic range, it's a very broad spectrum stuffed into one song. So that takes the cake for me.
Yeah, from what I do know, I would either go with Space Oddity, that, or so many metal bands have covered Moon Age Daydream. That
Nice.
I'm not even sure if I know the original at this point.
Have you seen Guardians of the Galaxy?
Yes.
Yeah, it was in there when they go into nowhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I mean, I'm sure I've heard it, but what comes to mind are covers of it because I've heard so many of them.
Actually, it's interesting. The day that Bowie, I don't know what this even means, but the day that I woke up and like the first thing I saw on all my news feeds was that David Bowie had died. I woke up with Moonage Daydream in my head. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that means, but I
That
was
means you're tuned in, man. You're a
probably
star
means
man too.
it probably means that my wife wanted to watch Guardians of the Galaxy the night before.
All right. Any other thoughts, guys?
Yeah, if I could plug a book,
Absolutely.
that is a friend of mine, Peter Biebergal. I think I mentioned it before, Bebergal. And his book is called Season of the Witch: How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll.
Yeah.
And man, it's, of course there's a nice big section on Bowie in the book, but it's really if you're into the occult, if you're into rock and roll, if you're into that nice little Venn diagram where both come together, which I find endlessly fascinating, you got to pick up the book. I mean, it covers everything from folk rock through metal, and the early kind of dark metal of Sabbath and Coven, all the way up through current sort of dark metal and bands like Sun and experimental stuff, prog rock. It covers it all. So
Nice.
since we touched on that subject tonight, it's a book I heartily recommend. And if you get to, Peter's done some podcasts and things like that too. He's great. He's just a super knowledgeable guy and really fun to listen to. So again, the book is Season of the Witch: How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll. And if that's if that's your wheelhouse, you really need to read that book. It's totally fascinating.
Cool. Red pill.
Um, I had just found, just right after he died, Bowie, there was obviously a ton of articles about him. And Adam Gorightly, who, as you may know, he's like a guy who's keeping the flame of Discordianism alive. He posted this link on his Facebook page about the very first appearance of David Bowie on television when he was just 17 years old, and it was kind of like, obviously it was some kind of publicity gimmick for his then band, the Manish Boys, but in a way, it was also some kind of like Discordian act on it in itself, because he and his band members were there on this BBC program as quote unquote representatives of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Long-Haired Men.
Yeah.
so, so yeah, there's this very all black and white like 3 minute clip on YouTube, which you can watch David Bowie, sporting this, very very 60s long hair, and saying how they were tired, of why should people why other people should persecute us because of our long hair and all that. So it's, yeah, showing how Bowie was always making fun of the rest of society in a way, right? Like always having the upper hand, and the last laugh.
Nice. Nice. All right. Anything else, guys?
Well, just to quickly piggyback off of what Miguel said, there are a lot of clips of David Bowie making cameos and doing different comedy sketches and whatnot, and it's interesting that his death coincided very closely with someone else who I really admire, Alan Rickman. And
Oh
one of
yeah.
the quotes of Alan Rickman that I've always cited, which is one that David Bowie seemed to live by, was that Alan Rickman once said, "I take my work very seriously and myself not at all." So, so
Nice.
which I think is might be a fitting way to end this evening.
Well, let me throw in one more very quick thing, because now that
Or
you brought
not. Jeez.
Rickman up,
Damn it, Michael. You killed my moment there.
sorry, but you brought up Rickman, and there was actually I've discovered this on Facebook too. Someone posted it. There's a Simpsons episode, and I think I've gone off on how synchronistic the Simpsons has been in my life. There's a
Hmm.
Simpsons episode where with Alan Rickman, when I think um, it's it's one of their crazy musical bits, and Alan Rickman just pops up, and they're playing a Bowie song. I think it's All the Young Dudes or something like that he covered. And so there was the coincidence of Rickman and Bowie in The Simpsons, which I'll just throw that out there. But the fact that they died around the same time, and here The Simpsons had them featured kind of right next to each other, just as yet another one of those damn Simpson synchronicities that
Simpsonistic.
it's Simpson chronistic.
There's a book there. Somebody write the book.
All right. Thank you so much, guys.
All right.
Our
Thanks a
pleasure.
lot. So
Yeah.
much fun as always.